Welcome to the Focus on Leadership podcast. We are taping at the Missouri Athletic Club, and I am excited as usual for our guest and to dive into conversations on leadership, legacy, and impact. And joining me this morning is, I feel like there should be a drum roll. Yes, if you're listening, drum roll please. It's none other than Anna Crosslin. Many of you may recognize that name as the former president and CEO of the International Institute. And I am proud and pleased to say that she is also focuses inaugural Executive-In-Residence, and she has just dove into the work. But join me in giving a virtual round of applause out there to Anna Crosslin for joining me here today on our podcast. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, now that you're retired, I feel like I see you more often. How do you do that?
Well, we have to remember that in a COVID world, we didn't see each other except on screen for a while.
That is correct.
So now it seems like everybody's making up for lost time. And there are so many meetings and events and different opportunities to be able to be engaged in the community. Almost too many for a retiree like me, but I'm trying to keep up with it.
I don't think there's such a thing as retirement for you. I think this is Anna Crosslin 3.0.
Well, there is a little bit of truth to that. One of the things that somebody recently asked me was, how did I enjoy retirement? And I said, much more from the point of view that I don't have to be anywhere at a specific time. I don't have the responsibilities that I had before of a staff of 100 and budgets and negotiations and all of these kinds of things that one has to face on a daily basis. Instead, I have the opportunity to be able to use my brain and to help communities and organizations grow, but I don't necessarily have to do all the hands-on work myself anymore, and that's great.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I love you in terms of you're always thinking of civic engagement and how to give back. And you model that so well over the many decades of your career. So let's dive into our conversation this morning or afternoon, whenever you have downloaded this to listen. But what inspired you to choose this career path?
You mean the International Institute
Yes.
or leadership? All of it.
All of it. All of the above, yes.
You would have to, in my case, it really goes back to birth and who I am and my family environment, how I grew up. Because I grew up in a multicultural household. My mother was a Japanese national. She passed last year at 96 years of age.
So sorry.
But came to the United States then in the 1950s as the wife of an American serviceman. And so she spent her life really living with a foot in two worlds, as I said, two cultural worlds. And I saw how she was able to negotiate it, but how much easier it would have been for her if there'd been some supportive services, some people around to be able to help her with that adjustment process. And so into my adulthood then, as I came to St. Louis from Seattle, and I worked for a number of years at Washington University, then when this opportunity came available at the International Institute, and they explained what the International Institute was to me, and I said, oh, my God, this has the potential to be a match between my personal and a professional mission. Mm-hmm. And it was for 42 years. And that's why, in fact, I was able to stay and grow and not just appreciate the work of the International Institute, but to enjoy the work of the International Institute. And that's what keeps you going for so long, is there has to be a touch of enjoyment there as well.
That's great. So what core values would you say has guided your decisions and your actions?
Oh, golly. The core value, my core values in some ways are similar to the core values of the International Institute. One wouldn't be surprised about that because anytime a leader is there for 42 years, then, there is some imprinting that's going on. But, issues like multiculturalism, about valuing individuals and their contributions and to the whole, about and mission, probably mission along with core values has been really one of the most moving of the drivers for me. in the middle of that storyline that I told you a moment ago, and then thinking about these core values, what do I want to really pass on or leave behind? I want to leave the world in a slightly better place than it was when I came into it.
Yeah.
I don't expect perfection. I don't expect that everything's going to change, but I want to feel that the world is in a slightly better place than it was when I came into it, and I want to feel that I made a contribution toward helping that happen.
And I believe you have. And if you could look back or perhaps look ahead, what would you say was your proudest moment?
Oh, golly. There's big and small. It's not about accolades. It's not about the recognition really was on behalf of the Institute, even when it was given to me individually. My proudest moments probably had to do with people that over the years we served, and that I then had opportunity to have contact with later. I think of a story, for instance, of a young Cambodian girl and her mom. And this would have been back in the 1980s. And if you think about the Cambodian genocide at the time and the refugees that were being resettled in the United States and here in St. Louis, we had I still remember this family, the family of two. The woman had lost her husband and 6 other children, and the only child she had left was this one little girl who arrived over here with a massive, I don't remember the name of the medical issue, but it is like elephantiasis. It's like growth of tumors in the head, so that it was massive. And she had a very, very small chance of surviving surgery, and yet she had to have it to live. The best cranial surgery, one of the best cranial surgery surgeons in the world was located at Barnes Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And he agreed to do the surgery then on Medicaid. Mm-hmm. And so the opportunity was there for her to have the surgery. And at the last minute then, as the surgery was to take place, the mom just lost her courage and said, I can't do this. I can't sign the papers to let her to have the surgery. And we said, why? Because she has to have it to live. And they said yes. She said yes, but she might die also, and she's my last child.
Oh, wow.
Finally, she agreed to do it. And about a year later, then I'm at the old National grocery store down the street, and this little woman kind of tugs on my shirt and says, hello, hello. Mm-hmm. And I look down at her, and I wonder who in the world this woman is. And then she points over at this beautiful little girl standing next to the grocery cart a few feet away, and it's the girl. And she's gorgeous. Oh, wow. And she survived the operation. And she was there. She was able to grow up and to have the future. And to me, that was one of the moments here, 35 years later, that I still remember, because it's about people. It's not about places or anything else. The heart of what we did was about people.
Wow. That is, I'm getting emotional here just hearing that
and
story.
I'm getting emotional 35 years later thinking about
that,
it.
The power of you being there and standing with that mom in that moment and, encouraging her to make what was a profound decision for her only remaining child. Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's great. Wow, thank you for that. So I asked you of what your proudest moment is. What's been your most challenging? Oh. And how did you address that?
Oh, golly. Probably the most challenging moments were not about the actual work of the International Institute here in St. Louis, but about the outside forces and how they affected the ability to be able to do that work. And most of it was politics, quite frankly. And in the last few years before my retirement at the federal level, if you think about it, I was in fact thinking about considering retirement when I reached 66 years of age, which was in 2016, and then the election occurred, and President Trump came into the first thing he did at that point, if we remember, within a week of his inauguration, was the Syrian ban, was the Muslim ban at that point, and from there on through for 4 years, we fought for every single on behalf of every single refugee who arrived here in St. Louis who was Muslim, because the forces out there were darned if they were going to let a single person, regardless of their compelling story, their family members, or anyone else in. This was a change. I would remind the people who are listening to this, who may in fact not have known, that up until a decade ago, let's say, refugee resettlement was really pretty much of a bipartisan issue. At a time when Congress, when the GOP and the Democrats were able to get together on certain issues, refugee resettlement was one of them. They had different reasons why they supported refugee resettlement. On the Democratic side, it might have been for humanitarian parole, and issues on the Republican side, it had to do with the need for additional population and workers. But they both could get behind refugee resettlement, and we therefore enjoyed rational conversations about an issue that had many, many positive impacts to it.
Right.
The last 5 years or so of my work at the Institute, we didn't have that kind of rationality, and it made it much more difficult to do the work of the organization.
But you powered through.
We powered through, and I made a commitment that I would stay for 4 years until 2020, with the expectation that regardless then of whether Trump was reelected or there was a new president, that it was time for a transition. Yeah, but I gave it those 4 years because I knew that my experience and expertise was necessary to try to be able to negotiate the labyrinth of different kinds of resettlement requirements and needs that were out there.
Labyrinth, that's a really great word to use, because, I think of the evolving role of today's CEOs, and there are many mega threats out there that CEOs are encountering. What advice would you give to either those individuals that are aspiring to be CEOs, or perhaps sitting CEOs, in light of the mega threats that the world is experiencing?
Probably, to me at least, one of the things that was so obvious in the 42 years that I served at the International Institute was that nothing ever stays the same.
Correct.
That regardless of whether you have a good model or not, regardless of whether you think it's the best model that's out there or not, one always has to be prepared for change, whether you want it or not. And you have to have a couple of different game plans up your sleeve, if you want to call it that.
Right.
I always played scenarios. Well, if this happens, then I have to do this. If this happens, then I have to do this. Because if I wasn't playing those scenarios out in advance, then I was too surprised when it actually occurred. And boy, surprise is one of those things that isn't abnormal. It seems to be very much normal these days. Yeah.
That's correct.
So it's about never being complacent, never being satisfied. One of the things that was perhaps frustrating about my work during my tenure was that I could never rest on quote-unquote laurels. Even when something happened and it was good or it was right, I had to be looking for the next opportunity, and I had to be looking for the next possible solution if something went wrong. Because you couldn't just assume, someone else would be there to pick up the pieces.
It's you.
Yeah, the buck stopped with the CEO. It stopped with me. It stops with any CEO. And if someone looking to be a CEO someday is not prepared to carry that weight on his or her or their shoulders,
right,
then they have to think twice about whether they're willing to accept that role or not.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There might be another role for them to explore.
Yeah.
So here's a fun question.
Yeah.
Let's say you have been invited to dinner with a billionaire. Who are the 5 people that you would invite to that dinner, and why?
Oh, my goodness. So this could be any billionaire.
Any billionaire.
Well, I can
Yes.
think of a couple of them I wouldn't want to have dinner with.
Okay, we can talk about that later too.
But
Yes.
that would be another. I don't have a lot of interest in having dinner with certain billionaires, but I could think of a couple others that I would.
Yes.
And based on that, then I would look for the brightest. I would look for the brightest people in a community who can really sell the value of whatever the product is at that point that I'm wanting through probably soft sell as opposed to hard sell to get a message across to that billionaire. I want to engage that billionaire and be able to make them feel interested in asking questions and following up on the dinner. Because you don't ever close a deal in one event
Right.
at something like that. You don't ever close a deal, especially at a dinner. But what you do is you intrigue a person at that point so that they want to come back and hear more.
Right.
So at that point, then, if I think about, is it St. Louis, for instance, and do I
Yes.
want to, do I
We
want
could
to
start St. Louis Global. Yes.
Right? Do I want to excite people about what the potential of St. Louis is at that point?
Yes.
Well, then it's people like, and I'm going to easy people because they're people I know at that point
Or that
too,
you've seen
right?
recently,
Or
right?
that I've
Yes.
talked with, and I know what they're going to say.
Yes.
But people like Betsy Cohen have a great
Absolutely.
story about St. Louis at that point, and a story that people don't necessarily know. And so people will say, "Tell me more."
Right.
Jody Sowell at the History Museum and
Yes.
I am St. Louis and let me introduce
love
myself
that.
is
Yes.
is fascinating to people who don't know their own hometown.
That's true.
And so that's another person that I'd put at the table. I would put you at the table, Yemi,
listen to you.
because
Yes.
you have such a knowledge, a broad knowledge of the community and the people who are within it, that there's hardly a person who's in a position of responsibility right here that you haven't met at some point or another.
That is correct.
And so that is having somebody there who knows everybody is really important. You have people who tell the story. You have people who know people. You have people who can sell and close a deal there
That is correct.
in terms of getting to the next step. These are the kind of people, and I know I only have 3 at the table right
I was
now.
counting.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
But I'm saying that these are the kind of people that people like Ruth Kim who
That is true.
can synthesize a discussion and come up with the key points at that point
She's
are
fantastic.
absolutely critical to these kinds of decisions because, I can ramble on for 5 minutes about what I really want to do and what I want to say. And then she says, oh, so these are your 3 key points. And she has them right there and she can articulate them. That's absolutely fascinating and part of an important discussion at that point.
Right.
And then you have a doer. You have to have an implementer because what you have is you have all these people who are sitting around talking. That's wonderful. That's the first step. But that's where somebody actually circles around to somebody like Betsy Cohen and some of her staff, who are there also. But it has to do then with the people who have the passion and the knowledge and who can follow a plan and who will make things happen at that point and come up with results. And so that 5th person isn't really a person, but it's a type of person. It can be many, many different people, but it is the implementer. She, he, they are the implementer that make this whole process work at that point and follow up and remind people of what they all agreed to do.
That is so true. Let's put our heads together.
Let's find the billionaire
Let's
now,
find the
right?
billionaire
Yeah, let's find the billionaire and try this
yes,
out. Huh?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I know just the restaurant that we could go to
Good.
for this. So, wow, you and I could talk for hours. We've talked for hours. My final question to you is, what is your biggest hope for the St. Louis region?
St. Louis is my adopted home. I came from Seattle to attend Washington University back in the 60s. And although prior to that, then, as I alluded to earlier, my father was in the military and I had traveled around and lived a considerable number of places. But I have now lived in St. Louis for so long that I guess I have to claim it as my home because, I've been here for 50 or 60 years. What I wish about St. Louis is that, and this goes back to, is that it becomes a city where the question, where did you go to high school, is no longer asked because there are so many people who have come from other places that they can't answer that question.
True.
That if we can, and so my point is that if we can attract enough people to St. Louis, and we need them desperately, if we can attract enough people to St. Louis, and they bring ideas and opportunities that are so needed within our region, then that will be the advantage that we'll have. When they ask, where did you go to high school? Oh, I don't know. I went, you wouldn't know I came from. You wouldn't know because,
Right.
You say that you ask that to 5 different people, and 5 different people say, oh, I don't know because I came from somewhere else. You probably don't ask the 6th person because it suddenly starts. You can ask it now because most people here are still from St. Louis.
Right.
Let's flip that dynamic around because the region needs it. We need people. We're in a situation where the population of St. Louis, the city of St. Louis, has dropped from 850,000 people in 1950, I believe it was, down to under 300,000 people now. The region is also losing population. The St. Louis County is also losing population. The growth in the rest of the region is not as fast as it should be. The state of Missouri is aging in a way that's going to have a dynamic that's very negative for our output and our position in the country. We have a problem in this state and in this region, and we need more new, younger people to be able to help reverse the trends.
Well, I believe we are on our way with some of our economic development initiatives, and I suspect that you are thinking of a project right now based on this conversation that we're going to invite our audience to participate in. But I want to thank you. This time has just flown by. I want to thank you for joining us here at the Missouri Athletic Club for the Focus on Leadership podcast. It is always a pleasure, Anna.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to our next podcast.